A very warm welcome to all of you on News9 Live. I'm Kartikeya Sharma and I'm joined by a very noted author and academician, Salvatore Babones. Thank you very much for making time for us. And let me begin this conversation by asking you, how does one country sets its record straight in terms of narrative? In the last 50 years, if you look at American narrative, it's about democracy. For French, it's about liberty. For China, it's about reclaiming the lost pride and heft. What is the Indian narrative today?
The problem for India is that India is not in control of its own narrative. Most Western countries, people in most Western countries, know very little about India, with the result that the small amount that trickles out dominates Western views of India. There's not a strong Indian presence in global media. Now that's changing as Indian media companies reach out to the world. It's changing as a new generation of Indian intellectuals reach out to the world. But it's something that a government, especially a democratic government, can't do for itself. This is something that the people do. The people create a national narrative. And India is only now really being that visible on the global stage.
But how does one create a narrative? For example, our terrorist becomes someone else's freedom fighter. For example, Panun, Niger. They are people who represent Khalistani forces, a subversive politics. But then they have all the accommodation they require from Americas.
I hate to break it to you, the world has never heard of Khalistan. Now, of course, in India, Khalistan's a huge issue. In Canada, even in Canada, where it's become a centerpiece of Canadian foreign policy, ordinary Canadians have no idea what it is. The simple fact is that a government can't set its country's image abroad. Dr. Jaishankar, for all that he does for India abroad, can't set the India narrative. The India narrative has to come from Indians. Now, as Indians are increasingly prominent on the global stage, we'll hear a lot more of that. But the unified narrative that will arise from that is something that no one can quite foresee because Indians themselves don't have a consensus on what it means to be Indian. As Indians discuss that, as they debate that, as they come to some idea in the 21st century of what it really means, not to be a colonial country. Let me put it this way. When Indians come to understand what it means to be Bharat, then India will have a global narrative.
You are saying that there is a fracture in context of domestic politics. So my next question is, do you feel that the Nehruvian consensus has been displaced by the new politics of Prime Minister Modi?
There's certainly a battle between those two views of India. It is being displaced. I won't say it has been displaced. There is a new establishment arising in India. Some would say that with the opening of the Ram Mandir in Ayodhya, that symbolically represents the ascendancy of the new India narrative. But of course, the old India still is intellectually very powerful and very coherent, and importantly, dominates international perceptions of India. Now, as India solidifies this new sense of national identity, that will create a new impression of India abroad. Remember, it's not so long ago since India was a fundamentally isolationist country. India's entry into the global stage might be marked for many people only to 2023 and the G20 summit. That for many people, that's the moment when they first heard of India. Give it a decade or two. This is long-term work. You can't have a strong global knowledge of India until India has already decided what it is itself.
But if you look at globally, India also reflects the global sentiments. The sort of left of center tilt which India had earlier is not so anymore. You have new idioms which are being talked about, which is civilizational. Yes. Young country and an old nation, that discontinuity in politics is manifesting itself because everything cannot be seen from a continuity point of view.
Of course there are these different views of India, but let me put this from an American standpoint. In the United States, intellectuals for the last decade have been trying to reframe America as a slave country, a country whose primary identity is slavery. Has that traveled outside America? Of course it hasn't, because people have been talking about America internationally now for 100 years or so. America has been a big topic of conversation around the world. They have formed their own view. They've heard from many Americans. They have a deep knowledge of the United States. Many people outside the US know more about American presidents and more American election trivia than I know. We're not there yet with India. Right? India's
That's the American narrative. It's like the way Vietnam War was covered by American movie industry. You get a different view altogether.
There are a million different views of America. The point is that the American narrative that's been formed in the rest of the world took 100 years to be formed. The India narrative will also take 100 years. Come back and talk to me. Well, don't talk to me, I'll be gone. Talk to someone in the year 2200. Then there will be a real understanding of India in the world. Today, it's just premature. It's information. I think people have to be patient, but they also have to work hard. Right? This generation today is the generation that will create the world's knowledge of India.
Okay, I'll come back to the topic of the narrative, but is there a difference between the right-wing winds of Europe and India's cultural expression through civilizational moving? Is there a difference?
There's always a difference. The European right wing has nothing to do with the Indian, what you call the Indian right. The words left and right don't really travel very well. They mean completely different things in different countries. There's nothing right-wing about the civilizational state narrative in India. If you go to Europe, the right wing is considered the nation-state narrative. Is extremely opposed to the civilizational state. The civilizational state idea would be considered more of a liberal narrative in Western Europe. So there's really no correspondence between left and right across countries.
Is Europe's right-wing politics also a result of unplanned immigration from West Asia, American foreign policy, breakdown of the states, thousands of people coming in, and there is no cultural connectedness, there's no common language, there's no shared experience in terms of food, clothes, living, worldview, gender?
Look, immigration in Europe, Western Europe primarily from poor countries, has been an important electoral issue. I don't think it has really shaped Europeans' understandings of themselves. And I say that because the places in Europe that have the strongest nationalist movements are in Eastern Europe, which has had very few immigrants from poor developing countries, has a minuscule Muslim presence in Eastern Europe.
Are you saying that it doesn't have any impact on the right-wing politics?
I'm not saying it doesn't have an impact. I'm saying that it is not primarily what's responsible. And I know that because the places where right-wing politics are strongest are exactly the places that have not received large numbers of immigrants. Immigrants are going to places that are generally more liberal in outlook and, frankly, richer economically. But all of this really is not particularly meaningful for India. The question of what kind of state India is not a question that has its origins in Europe. If anything, it has its origins in a reaction against European colonialism, that India had previously accepted European definitions of what India means. After all, the very word India itself is an exonym. It's imported into India from the outside. It's not what Indians historically called India, it's what outsiders called India. Well, now that India is thinking about how does it want to define itself, that's not a reaction to things happening in Europe, that's not on a pattern of things happening in Europe, it's not connected to America, it's all about India.
It's all about India.
Or Bharat, if you will.
But then, there is also a binary. For example, it took world to realize that we were victims of terrorism for 9/11 to happen. Or for example, the way things are constructed differently. Kashmir is a story of integration and empowerment. It became a story of suppression. Or for example, the strategic autonomy, which Jaishankar spoke about. India first, okay, people might have problem with it, but it's not neutrality. I mean, the West was high on the Russian gas, but India was being accused of financing a dictator, whereas there's no question asked when Germans invest so much of money in China, and when the first of which that Trump takes is to Riyadh.
Well, look, here we're moving from the high plane of civilizational discourse to the low plane of everyday politics. In everyday politics, every weapon is used, and a lot of these weapons are unfair. The question is, do they stick in people's minds? So the criticism of India for buying Russian oil stuck in people's minds. That's fine, but this will pass. No one's going to remember this in 10 years. It doesn't identify India to the world.
Do you think globally the right-wing shift which is taking place, is it for a short term or for a long stay, for a long haul?
First, I really want to emphasize left and right mean completely different things in different countries. There's no correspondence between them. Second, even if people do want to identify a right-wing shift, people have been warning about that this entire century. So I've been hearing since 2001 about a right-wing turn in politics. In fact, politics in all healthy democracies is cyclical. One side comes in, it has a run for 10, 15 years, then it gets tired, and the other side comes in and takes over. There's no democratic country, no well-institutionalized democratic country where one side dominates politics. It's always a matter of just waiting for time for the wave to reverse itself, and the wave inevitably reverses itself because people get tired of incumbents. Now, here in India, you're very well aware of that, where the BJP takes as an explicit strategy, put in new candidates because people are tired of their incumbents. That's very clever, but it still won't stop the fact that eventually, of course, there will be the wave goes out and the wave comes in. And that happens in all democracies.
Before I close in my interview, do you think that we need more people to write in the Bharatiya idiom? For example, there are words which we take from various histories, Trojan horse, the Gordian knot, Pyrrhic victory. If you have gone through some literature in India, which I suppose you would have, there are words which people use locally, like the Panipat movement, or the Awadh syndrome, Satyajit Ray's very famous film, Shatranj Ke Khiladi, where two Nawabs are playing chess, and then you have the company, the whole platoon walking past by. So it was a metaphor that's what people did in the Principality of Awadh. They were playing chess, and they didn't realize that history was marching past by them. So those idioms are still not part of our writing. So the question is, do we need more writers writing about India, or do we need more people writing in the Bharatiya idiom?
Indians have to introduce their own idioms to the rest of the world. China has done that, and China has not done that as a country. No one cares what the Chinese Communist Party writes.
But they do that in foreign policy.
Oh, but they do it in foreign policy, but the rest of the world rolls its eyes at China because it's so clearly propaganda. However, Chinese intellectual concepts have filtered through into the rest of the world. I myself authored a book called American Tianxia, using the Chinese concept of civilization of all under heaven, Tianxia, to apply it to an American reality. Now, Chinese terminology and Chinese idioms have filtered through into Western discourse because so many Westerners visited China. There was so much interest in China. China's economy was booming until the last few years. There was so much engagement between China and the West. Now imagine India, which has a very large English language media, a very large English language publishing world where many, I would say virtually all intellectuals in India are able to write in English. Imagine over the next 20 years how much influence the Ramayana or the Mahabharata are going to have on global discourse. I think you'll be very pleasantly surprised.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much for making time for us. Thank you.